Get ready, everybody. We're diving deep into something you might not expect. Norway's waste management.
Norway.
Yeah, Norway, they've got that eco-champion reputation.
Yeah.
But a recent study from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, NTNU for short, suggests we might need to take a closer look at their trash.
Interesting. Because Norway has definitely been pushing that image of sustainability, especially when it comes to the circular economy.
Exactly. Less waste, more reusing resources, the whole 9 yards. So you can imagine our surprise when this NTNU study lands on our desk and is telling a different story. They didn't just look at collection data, they followed the trail. And what they found, well, it seems Norway might be closer to an incineration economy than a circular one.
So we're talking about a gap between what they say and what's actually happening.
Big time. They report over 40% plastic recycling, which sounds amazing.
Very impressive.
Right. But then NTNU does their meticulous tracking, and the real number is more like 28–29%. That's a huge difference.
It is. So how do we explain that?
Well, it seems like a lot rides on self-reporting from those waste processing companies. They tell the government what they recycle, but there's not a ton of checking up on what happens after that.
So it's kind of like saying, trust me, I did my homework, but not showing the teacher.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to make it even trickier, Norway, they export a lot of their waste.
Out of sight, out of mind, as they say.
Sadly, yeah. So we've got potential for iffy data.
Yeah.
Lack of transparency with all that exporting. What else is going on here?
Well, we've got to factor in the economics. Incineration, even though it's not ideal, it's often cheaper, easier than really recycling stuff, especially plastic.
The path of least resistance wins again.
Seems to be the case, unfortunately. And plastic, that can be a whole other beast to recycle properly.
It really is. Every single plastic item has its own rule book, And forget about trying to decode those tiny symbols they put on packaging.
All right, it gets complicated.
It does. And speaking of plastic, this NTNU study, they really zeroed in on the difference between those reported plastic recycling rates and what's really happening, all based on data from Green Dot Norway.
Green Dot Norway.
Yeah, they're the ones who handle a lot of that industrial packaging waste, so their data, it's pretty insightful and kind of eyebrow-raising.
Okay, so tell me more about Green Dot Norway and how they fit into this. So Green Dot Norway, they're like the organizers for recycling packaging waste, the system behind it all. Companies, they pay a fee to be part of this system, and that money is supposed to make sure their packaging actually gets recycled.
So they're the ones making sure those yogurt containers and cereal boxes don't end up in a landfill somewhere. Important job.
Exactly. But here's the catch. Green Dot Norway, their own data tells a different story than those official recycling numbers Norway puts out. Turns out, a lot of the plastic packaging, maybe even 2/3 of it, that's collected for recycling, it ends up incinerated or landfilled anyway.
Wait, so even if it's put in the recycling, it still might get burned or landfilled? That's kind of depressing.
It really shows you how complicated recycling actually is. It's not just about putting something in the right bin. It's a whole process, and sometimes that process, well, it breaks down.
Speaking of breakdowns, what about the environmental impact of all this incineration? Norway, they're supposed to be cutting their carbon footprint, right?
It's definitely a concern. Some people will say that burning waste for energy, waste to energy, that it can be a substitute for fossil fuels, but you're still creating pollution, still releasing greenhouse gases. And the bigger issue, that depletion of resources, that's not going away.
Right. It's like we're just hiding the problem
Yeah.
instead of actually changing how we use things.
Yeah.
It's a bit overwhelming, honestly.
Yeah.
If Norway, with their eco-friendly image, if they're struggling, what does that mean for the rest of the world?
It's a fair question, and yeah, it can be discouraging, but I think this study, it's a wake-up call, a chance to learn something important.
Like what?
Well, it shows how important transparency and accountability are when we're talking about sustainability for everyone.
So we can't just assume that everything's being taken care of.
Right. We need to know where waste is going, how it's being managed, and we need to be able to follow up on that.
So it's not enough to just trust but verify.
Exactly. And this whole situation with Norway, it shows how important it is to dig deeper, look beyond those rosy recycling statistics. And that goes for everyone. Consumers, policymakers, industry leaders.
So where do we go from here? What can we actually do about this? This NTNU study, it's not just pointing out problems, right? There are some solutions in there too, aren't there?
Absolutely. They have a whole plan. First, they say we need to be able to track waste throughout the entire process. Like when you set a package and you get a tracking number, right?
Yeah, so you can see where it is every step of the way.
Exactly. That's the kind of transparency we need to hold everyone accountable and make sure that recycling actually means recycling.
Makes sense. What else do they recommend?
More transparency from recycling companies themselves. Consumers should be able to easily find out what happens to their waste, how effective recycling really is.
No more hiding behind vague language and those confusing symbols. Just clear, simple information.
Right. Give people the information they need to make informed decisions, and then they can put pressure on companies to actually follow through on their promises.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the fact that incineration is often cheaper than recycling? How do we change that?
That's where policymakers come in. NTNU says we need stricter rules for how products are designed, make sure they can actually be recycled. And they say we need policies that make real recycling more appealing financially.
So instead of asking consumers to do all the sorting and hoping for the best, we need to make sure companies are thinking about sustainability from the very beginning.
Exactly. It's a team effort. Individuals are important, but real change, systemic change, that takes businesses, governments, and everyday people all working together.
It's a reminder that even Norway, a country that's always held up as an example, even they have room for improvement. And maybe even more importantly, we all need to be willing to question the status quo, keep digging for the truth.
Well said. We can't just get comfortable, especially when it comes to something as important as waste management and creating a true circular economy.
Absolutely. And it all starts with admitting that even the greenest countries, well, they might not be as squeaky clean as we thought.
I like that. Squeaky clean. But yeah, transparency is key, and conversations like this, raising awareness, asking tough questions, that's how we start.
And speaking of tough questions, this study from NTNU, they found that Norway, they actually ship a good chunk of their waste, the stuff they can't recycle easily. They ship it off to Sweden to be incinerated. What's going on there?
It's all about transparency, right? Like we were saying before, you got to follow the trail. So Norway, they might have low incineration rates, but that's only if you look inside their borders. They ship a chunk of their waste, that stuff they can't recycle easily, about 15–20% of it off to Sweden, and guess what happens to it there?
It gets burned.
Exactly. Out of sight, out of mind. Norway gets to keep those incineration numbers down, but someone else is dealing with the consequences.
So are they really an eco-champion if they're just exporting their pollution? Feels a bit like cheating the system.
Right. It's a question of global responsibility. Can one country really claim to be sustainable if they're just pushing their waste problem onto someone else? And it makes you wonder what else isn't being talked about when we see these global recycling numbers. How much are we really recycling versus just shifting the problem around?
It's like those made-in labels. We think we know what they mean, but there's a whole chain of events behind them.
Exactly. So much happens behind the scenes. It all comes down to being critical. Don't just take statistics at face value, dig a little deeper, get the full picture.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the most important thing for our listeners to remember?
I'd say it's this. We can't just keep doing things the same way and expect different results. If we really want a circular economy here in Norway and everywhere else, we need a serious change in mindset. It's not enough to recycle more. We need to rethink our whole relationship with stuff, how we consume, how we deal with waste.
Got to be a closed loop, right?
Exactly, and that takes everyone working together. Governments setting stricter rules, companies designing products with the whole life cycle in mind, and yeah, everyday people making conscious choices about what they buy and how they dispose of things.
Sounds like we always say, put on your critical thinking caps, folks.
It's true. Stay informed, ask questions, and let's make some noise about this.
I like that. Make some noise. A big thank you to the researchers at NTNU for their groundbreaking work on this, and to our amazing listeners for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure being here.
And remember, folks, just because something seems green on the surface, always look a little closer. You might be surprised what you find. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.